Hey, what's up? I got banks. So, two things I want to focus on in this lesson, which, if you're following the 180 Days of Lang series, this is the lesson that I introduce after we hit all the pieces of rhetorical situation. And it's going to serve two purposes. It's our first foray into rhetorically analyzing a longer text, a speech in this case, or an excerpt from a speech. And then it's also going to introduce our first, it's not even an essay, it's kind of like the first building block towards an essay. So let me show you how I do both of those things in one lesson. And what we focus on in this lesson in my class is an excerpt from Malala Yousafzai's speech to the United Nations, a really famous one where she said, I think the closing line is, "One child, one book, and one pen can change the world." So this one is very famous now, and double check with your other English teachers because I know some teachers actually use this in lower grade levels. It's in my 10th grade textbook series. So if I just know that my kids have not had this one yet at my new school, but you can certainly swap this out with another text. So because of just the power of the speaker, in this case Malala, I like to show a little bit about her. Some students probably aren't familiar with her and her story. So there was a quick sit-down interview with Diane Sawyer from 60 Minutes that I play. You can just search for that on YouTube. But it explained just what happened to her in Pakistan and who she was and what her road was to become this ambassador person to the UN. And so then after that, because students really only have rhetorical situation features to go off of, we haven't really talked about the appeals yet, I really want to guide them through our first analysis. So you see this sort of layout of text. I came up with this design a long time ago, but this is what I've always used for, I call it analyzing text, and that's why it's supposed to look like the iPhone chat, like iMessage chat bubbles. Some kids pick up on that, some don't, but it still amuses me even now. But this is a way just to get kids into annotating. The first year I taught Lang, I just printed out the blank copies of the speeches and was like, let's mark for what's important. And I tried to verbally give them some directions, but it was a hot mess. So for getting into a text, this is a guided way in. So if you have students that are starting at the beginning of this kind of annotation and this type of analysis, I highly recommend structuring it where they have the text on the left and then some guiding prompts or questions on the right. So the questions that I go for are not just who is the speaker, who is the audience, but really prompting some analysis about that. So for example, the first question, how does Malala address the violence that many in her audience associate with her? And why does she address it this way? So it's asking them to dig a little bit deeper, all the more reason for them to read the background and maybe watch that video so they know what violence is being referred to there. So this is not the whole speech. I think this is excerpts from it. I'm pretty sure it's not the whole speech, but this has questions throughout and it introduces just briefly some of the choices. So I mentioned imagery, which is something most students are familiar with from literature class, either the structure choices, those sorts of things. So it's not only rhetorical situation, but it's a good bridge into that. So the way I would do this activity for the first time in class is I would read the speech out loud or play the speech if you want to find that on YouTube. She's a powerful speaker, and have the students listen along and then go back through them and model on the board or under your document camera or something, like what you're thinking as you read this and noticing about the craft of her speech, and then answering those questions. If you're following my units, students are going to do a lot of these activities over units 1 and 2. And this is just that you want to set the expectations for what you're looking for, especially if you're collecting these for a grade. So that's what I would do for the majority of class is annotation. If you have stronger students or they get more independent, you might do the first part together and then have them pair up and then gradually release it to independent work by the end. But they usually can finish this in a class period. And then we move on to their first mini introductory essay thing. So I focus on the role of education in the United States as the topic for my first writing piece in Unit 1. And I'm not focusing on evidence, commentary, evidence when we get there, but I'm not really focusing on those little parts. It's just baseline is all this is. So I'm asking for 250 to 500 words. I like them to handwrite this initial draft because we're going to be doing some group peer activities the next day with it. You can have them do it digitally if you prefer, but I asked them some questions about education, and their prompt is, what is the value or function of education in the United States today? I think this connects really well to the Malala piece because she's fighting for education for girls around the world. Our students in the United States often complain about mandated education, but I think that speech helps give them a little perspective. And then the other passage we're going to read in this unit is Thurgood Marshall's Brown v. Board decision, or parts from that. So that is the topic. There's some brainstorming ideas there, and I just give them a little half sheet, and that is their homework for tomorrow. So if I was in a block class, they might be able to finish this in the class period 2, or a draft of it. If you have a really short class, they might need to finish the annotations and then move on to this the next day. But that is where I start. Not with full essays. I've always felt like that's too much at the very beginning of the year. I want us to learn how to craft essays in a really precise way to these 3 forms, and we start small. I don't assume students have a massively successful set of skills coming in for essays. Yours might, and then you can take this out to a full essay. But that is how I introduce our first rhetorical analysis reading and our first major writing assignment.